In the spring of 183 BC, on a rocky coast in what is now northern Turkey, the most dangerous man the Roman Republic had ever faced poured a single measure of clear poison into a cup. He was 64 years old. He had spent 40 years running from Roman justice, and the Roman fleet had finally surrounded his villa. He raised the cup to his lips and spoke his final words to the men who had betrayed him. Let us relieve the Romans of their anxiety. He was not killed by a legion. He was driven to suicide by the very senators who had sworn to stand beside him. To understand why Rome spent 4 decades hunting this one man, you have to go back to the summer of 221 BC. Hannibal Barca was just 26 years old when he took command of the Carthaginian army in Spain. His father, Hamilcar, had made him swear a blood oath at age 9. He would never be a friend to Rome. But that oath was personal. The reality of his position was far worse than a child's vow. Carthage had lost the First Punic War to Rome 30 years earlier. The indemnity was crushing, 2,200 talents of silver paid over a decade. The navy Rome had sunk still lay at the bottom of the Mediterranean. When Hannibal inherited the Spanish command, he controlled exactly 80,000 soldiers, but nearly half were Iberian mercenaries whose loyalty was measured in gold coins, not patriotism. And between him and Rome's Italian heartland stood the Alps, a 15,000-foot wall of ice, rock, and hostile Gallic tribes that no general had ever crossed with a full army. In the spring of 218 BC, Hannibal made a decision that every Carthaginian senator, every Greek historian, and every Roman general considered suicidal. He would march his army over the Alps and invade Italy from the north. The overland route was 900 miles from the Ebro River to the Po Valley. He would need to cross the Pyrenees, the Rhone River, and the highest mountain passes in Europe. The Roman fleet controlled the sea. They expected him to invade by ship. By walking, he was betting that Rome's naval supremacy was useless against an army that moved on foot. He started with 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. But he knew, and he did not tell his soldiers, that more than half of them would not survive the crossing. The crossing took 15 days. 15 days of ice, avalanches, and ambushes from mountain tribes who rolled boulders down on the columns. Elephants slipped on frozen ledges and plunged into ravines. Pack mules carrying the army's grain tumbled into gorges, taking 3 months of rations with them. Hannibal lost 18,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry to the cold alone. He lost another 15,000 to starvation and tribal attacks. When the ragged survivors finally emerged into the Po Valley, Hannibal had just 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry left. He had lost more than half his army without fighting a single Roman soldier. The Roman Senate, hearing the reports, laughed. They assumed the Carthaginian general would retreat, go home, and admit the attempt had failed. He did not retreat. He looked at his exhausted, freezing men and ordered them to form a battle line. The first Roman army came to crush him in December of 218 BC. Tiberius Sempronius Longus commanded 42,000 Roman soldiers, roughly twice Hannibal's surviving force. The Romans were confident. They had heavy infantry, heavy cavalry, and a fully supplied camp. Hannibal had frozen, starving men and no supply lines. But he had something the Romans did not, a weather report. He knew the Trebia River valley froze solid at night and thawed in the afternoon. He sent his brother Mago with 1,000 cavalry and 1,000 Numidian light infantry to hide in the reeds along the river bank. At dawn, Hannibal ordered his cavalry to ride out, provoke the Roman camp, and then retreat across the river. The Romans chased them into the freezing water. When they reached the far bank, soaking wet and shivering, the reeds opened fire. Mago's hidden force struck the Roman rear. Hannibal's main infantry advanced on the frozen front. The battle lasted 4 hours. The Romans lost 28,000 men. Hannibal lost just 4,000. He had just destroyed a Roman consular army in the first pitched battle of the war. The following spring, Hannibal pulled off the same trick on a larger scale. The Roman consul Gaius Flaminius was marching south along the shore of Lake Trasimene, pursuing Hannibal through the Apennine valleys. Hannibal knew the terrain intimately. He stationed his cavalry and light infantry in the hills above the narrow lakeside road. When Flaminius's army marched into the defile, the Carthaginians closed the trap. The Romans could not turn left. They would drown in the lake. They could not turn right. They would be cut down by javelins from the heights. They could only march forward, pinned in a killing zone barely a mile long. The battle was over in 3 hours. 15,000 Romans died. Flaminius himself was killed by a Gaulish spearman. Hannibal lost fewer than 2,500 men. In 2 battles, he had destroyed 2 Roman armies and eliminated the only field forces between him and the gates of Rome itself. The Romans had learned nothing except that their generals were incompetent. In the summer of 216 BC, they assembled the largest army in the history of the Republic, 86,000 men, including 8 Roman legions and allied contingents from all over Italy. They placed them under the command of 2 consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. They marched straight to Cannae in southern Italy, where Hannibal was waiting with just 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. The Romans outnumbered Hannibal 2-1. The Roman Senate declared that victory was inevitable. Hannibal studied the field. The Roman infantry massed in the center, dense and heavy, exactly as their manuals dictated. Hannibal positioned his weaker troops in the center and his elite infantry on the wings. He deliberately formed a convex line, a bulge facing the Romans. When the Roman legions charged, they pushed the bulge inward. The convex line became a concave bowl. Hannibal's African heavy infantry closed in from the flanks, and his Numidian cavalry, which had spent the entire morning running circles around the Roman horse, struck from the rear. The trap was absolute. The Romans were encircled on 3 sides, facing inward, packed so tightly they could not lift their arms to swing their swords. The massacre lasted from noon until sunset. When the dust cleared, 50,000 to 60,000 Romans lay dead on the plain. Among them were 80 senators, 28 military tribunes, and the consul, Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Hannibal lost roughly 6,000 men. In a single afternoon, he had killed more Roman soldiers than Rome had lost in any other war in its entire history. After Cannae, Hannibal stood at the absolute peak of his military authority. He controlled nearly all of southern Italy. The Greek cities of Magna Graecia defected to him. Capua, the second greatest city in Italy, opened its gates. Hannibal had captured 20,000 Roman prisoners. He had gold, silver, and captured eagles, the sacred standards of the Roman legions. The Roman Senate sat in terror, convinced that Hannibal would march directly on Rome itself. But he did not. And that hesitation, that failure to finish the war, was not a military failure. It was a supply failure. Hannibal had no siege engines. He had no fleet. He had no reliable supply line from Carthage. He needed reinforcements, siege equipment, and most critically, 4,000 additional Numidian cavalry that his brother Mago had promised to bring from Spain. He sent repeated dispatches to the Carthaginian Senate, requesting exactly those reinforcements. The dispatches were read aloud in the council chambers, and each time the merchants and landed aristocrats who controlled the Senate voted to delay. They feared a general who might return to Carthage with a loyal army of veterans and seize the throne. 5 years passed. Hannibal held Italy. The Romans refused to engage him in open battle, using Fabian tactics, shadowing him, avoiding him, burning the crops ahead of his route. He wrote to Carthage 6 times. 6 times the Senate sent polite replies acknowledging his victories and confirming that additional resources were under consideration. Not a single extra soldier arrived. Not one new siege weapon was commissioned. Hannibal had to pay his Gallic mercenaries from captured Roman tribute because the silver from Carthage stopped coming. He was winning every battle and slowly bleeding to death from a broken supply chain. When he finally recalled his brother Hasdrubal from Spain to march overland with reinforcements, the Romans intercepted him before he could link up with Hannibal. The Carthaginian Senate had handed the war to a general who had never lost a single fight and denied him the supplies to win the campaign. In 204 BC, the Roman general Publius Cornelius Scipio invaded North Africa. He bypassed Hannibal entirely, burning the farms and estates of the Carthaginian nobles who had been voting down Hannibal's supply requests. Suddenly, the merchants and senators who had refused to send reinforcements for 15 years found their own lands on fire. They sued for peace. Scipio gave them harsh terms: surrender all their elephants, give up their fleet, and pay a massive indemnity. The senators begged Hannibal to return home to defend Carthage. And here is the betrayal. They did not call him home because they trusted him. They called him home because they had no one else left. Hannibal sailed back to Africa, leaving behind his army of Italian veterans. The Senate immediately began negotiating behind his back, offering Scipio concessions that undercut Hannibal's strategic position. They feared him more than they feared Rome. The Battle of Zama in 202 BC was not a defeat of Hannibal's generalship. It was a defeat of Carthaginian politics. Hannibal had trained a new army of 40,000 men. But these were not his Italian veterans. They were green conscripts, hastily levied farmers and city merchants, and critically, the Carthaginian Senate had surrendered their Numidian cavalry to Scipio as part of the pre-battle negotiations. Hannibal entered the field with no cavalry advantage. Scipio had 6,000 Numidian horsemen, the same cavalry Hannibal had been begging the Senate to send him for 15 years. Hannibal set his 80 war elephants in the front line to break the Roman infantry, but Scipio opened his ranks, letting the elephants charge through empty corridors. The Romans slaughtered the elephant crews with javelins. Hannibal's raw infantry broke within 2 hours. The Numidian cavalry that should have been on the Carthaginian flanks was now charging into the Carthaginian rear. It was the same encirclement that Hannibal had used at Cannae, but this time, the trap was sprung on him. He lost 25,000 men that day, but the true damage was not the bodies on the field. It was the Carthaginian nobles in the Senate who had already surrendered the cavalry and were now begging for Roman mercy, while Hannibal still had an army in the field. After Zama, Hannibal did something no defeated Carthaginian general had ever done. He took responsibility for the defeat, walked into the Senate chamber, and proposed a complete restructuring of Carthaginian government. He demanded that the ruling oligarchy be replaced with an elected council and that financial audits be conducted to root out corruption. The Senate had been stealing war funds for decades. They had been bribing the Numidian kings to stay neutral, then pocketing the bribe money instead of delivering the horses. Hannibal forced the reforms through by popular vote. For 7 years, he ran Carthage efficiently, eliminated the corruption, and even repaid the Roman indemnity early. But the oligarchs never forgave him. In 195 BC, they sent a delegation to Rome with a single message: "Hannibal is plotting a new war. We want you to arrest him." They could not kill him themselves. He was too popular, so they asked his enemies to do it for them. Hannibal fled Carthage in 195 BC, knowing that the Roman arrest party was already at the harbor. He became a fugitive, moving from court to court. Antiochus III of Syria, then Prusias I of Bithynia. He served as a military advisor, never commanding a Carthaginian army again. The Romans hounded him relentlessly. For 12 years, they sent embassies to every ruler who sheltered him, demanding his head. In 183 BC, the Roman ambassador Titus Quinctius Flamininus arrived at Prusias's court. Prusias, a coward and a client king of Rome, agreed to surrender Hannibal, but he did not arrest him publicly. He surrounded Hannibal's villa with soldiers and waited. Hannibal, 64 years old, realized that his own host had sold him out. He called for his servant to bring a cup of wine. He had always kept a ring with a small vial of poison, and he poured it into the glass. His last recorded words, as the soldiers broke down the door, were, "Let us now put an end to the great anxiety of the Romans." He drank the cup and died within minutes. He was not betrayed by a Roman sword. He was betrayed by a Carthaginian Senate, then a Syrian king, then a Bithynian monarch, men who valued Roman gold over the greatest general of their age. The Carthaginian oligarchs, who had denounced Hannibal to Rome, survived him by only 16 years. In 146 BC, the Roman Senate, having eliminated their greatest enemy, returned to Carthage one final time. The demand was unconditional surrender. The city itself was to be razed. The Roman armies breached the walls and burned the city to ash. The same merchants who had voted down Hannibal's reinforcements, the same nobles who had bribed the Numidian kings instead of supplying cavalry, watched their warehouses burn and their gold melt in the fire. The Romans enslaved the remaining 50,000 Carthaginians and sold them to the highest bidders. The city was plowed under and salted so that no one would ever rebuild it. The Carthaginian Senate, which had spent 40 years sabotaging its own greatest commander, was erased from history by the very republic it had tried to appease. Today, the harbor where the Carthaginian fleet once docked is a quiet suburban park outside modern Tunis. The Roman Forum still stands in Rome, but Hannibal's only surviving monument is not in Africa. It is a single bronze plaque in the Turkish town of Gebze, marking the hill where he drank his poison. History does not remember the names of the Carthaginian senators who voted to disarm their own general. But every schoolchild in the West still knows the name of the man who crossed the Alps, won at Cannae, and was destroyed not by Rome, but by the very city he was trying to save.